Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I hope everyone is having a beautiful day. It's getting pretty chilly outside, I would say. I guess we're kind of transitioning into winter a bit. It's Tuesday, December 1st. I'm sitting here in my dorm room and I'm very excited about the topic today that we're going to be discussing. It's pretty interesting. It has sort of a psychoanalysis vibe. I've been doing a lot of research on it and I couldn't help but share it with you guys, so let's dive right in. Today we're going to be talking about Alexander I and the influences on his reign. So sort of as an introduction, Alexander I was the son of Paul, aka the Mad Tsar, and grandson of Catherine the Great. So why was Paul called the Mad Tsar? Basically, he deposed all of Catherine's reforms. He also was really weird about Prussia, and a lot of people were suspicious that he was loyal to Prussia and not Russia. For example, he made soldiers wear uniforms that resembled the soldiers' uniforms of Prussia. He also made people kneel for the royal family, something that Prussians made their people do. Weird, right? He also overturned a law that said women could succeed men in the line for the throne. Yikes. Well, he ended up being assassinated just after 4 years of his reign. So Alexander I took over the Tsardom of Russia at just 16 years old in 1801. Can you imagine ruling a huge country at just 16 years old? I could not. He ended up ruling for 24 years until he died of typhus, which is not a very long time. He's widely known as the enigmatic Tsar, because he was really secretive and would make promises to people but would never go through with them. He was sort of like a flake. He made some reforms that a lot of historians praise him for, though. But I argue many of them were often contradictory in nature and often took effect in his conquered territories rather than his own country, which was pretty weird. But three early relationships in his life, with his tutor Ephraim La Harpe, his father Paul, and his grandmother Catherine II, are particularly helpful in understanding his perplexing personality and actions that we're going to talk about today. So to start, his first influence was his tutor Ephraim La Harpe. Alexander was raised by his grandmother Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, as we said before, who had him tutored by numerous scholars. La Harpe was the most influential, I would say. With the Enlightenment still occurring all over Europe, he made an effort to instill in Alexander principles of republicanism. These principles were often reflected in his conversations, but not necessarily in his actions, sort of like what I was saying about him being a flake. He was a lot of talk the talk, but he wasn't much of walk the walk. So anyways, La Harpe introduced Alexander to these Enlightenment ideals about a democracy and representative government. He preached liberal ideals, such as importance of citizens' rights, and Republican ideals, such as the values a leader should strive to maintain. Funny enough, even though he was the grandson of one of the most insanely bright women in all of Russian history, he was a pretty disappointing student. He was brilliant, but according to Donald Raleigh and A. Iskandarov in their book The Emperors and Empresses of Russia, Rediscovering the Romanovs, had an aversion to serious study, tended to be slow and lazy, and was inclined to idleness. This leads some to believe that he didn't actually learn much from his tutors, which may help explain these contradictions in his actions. The most notable example of this was the abolition of serfdom in his conquered territories, but the continuation of this practice in his home country. After taking control of Finland, Bessarabia, and Poland, he didn't establish the practice, and according to David Saunders in his book Russia in the Age of Reaction and Reform, 1801 to 1881, between 1816 and 1819, Alexander went on to abolish serfdom both in Livonia and in the adjacent provinces of Estland and Kurland. It's really confusing to understand why he would continue this terrible practice in his own country, but then abolish it in territories that he conquered. He even continued from Tim Chapman's book Imperial Russia, 1801 to 1905, supporting in some cases the start of constitutional government in his conquered territories. If La Harpe had instilled in Alexander such notions regarding the importance of citizens' rights, why would the emperor keep a practice that so harshly forbid them from his own people? So one explanation may be his egotism and his obsession with power. According to Raleigh and Iskandarov, he had an ability to take advantage of other people's trusting natures, which made him feel like a huge figure with an eye over everyone. One of the most interesting features about him is that not one person truly knew what he believed. He was able to sort of shapeshift his personality depending on who he was talking to, which made a lot of people feel comfortable with him. However, after he wouldn't go through with his promises was when they started to feel uneasy. Like, what all did you tell this guy, you know? For example, in 1802, Alexander promoted the power of the Senate by creating a decree that, according to Paul Bushkovich in his book, A Concise History of Russia, confirmed the Senate's existing powers, one being the maintenance of Russian laws. However, a year later, when they tried to create a new law, he simply overruled and rejected its verdict. A second example is when he reinstated Catherine's charter to the nobility, but with some reservations from Patrick O'Mara's book, The Russian Nobility in the Age of Alexander I. This basically laid out all the rights of nobles that his father had eradicated during his reign. Alexander reinstated it, but kind of said, psych, because it still restricted nobles. It led the public to believe he would rule with Enlightenment ideals like his grandmother, but really it just masked his more despotic ideology, I would say. Another reason could be that he was worried the elite class would grow too much in other countries and eventually overtake his reign. Once again, his obsession with control and power got in the way. So a third reason likely had to do with a change in La Harpe's thinking. When Alexander took the throne after Paul was assassinated in 1901, La Harpe, he kind of did take two with all of his Enlightenment teachings, and instead, from Raleigh in Iskandarov's book, warned his pupil against the illusory freedom of people's assemblies and liberal enthusiasms in general. He also advised Alexander to retain absolute power intact. La Harpe was like a father to Alexander, so he could have just been worried for his safety, but things don't add up. La Harpe's motive for changing Alexander's political ideology seems inconsistent with the means of doing so. He wanted Alexander to maintain control for his own safety, but he just saw what happened to a Tsar that wanted too much control. He gets killed by his people. Anyways, this change in La Harpe's ideology probably influenced Alexander's want for autocracy. Two other key relationships in Alexander's youth that likely influenced his confusing political ideology is the contrasting intentions of his closest family members, his father Paul and his grandmother Catherine II. So Alexander had a pretty rough childhood. Not rough compared to the millions of peasants, but sort of emotionally rough. Catherine and Paul had a really terrible relationship and always sort of treated him as the middleman. Catherine was super reluctant to have Paul succeed her and even started to compose a manifesto that would declare Alexander her heir instead of Paul in 1796, according to Raleigh and Iskandarov. This put Alexander in a very difficult position at a very young age. Would he betray his father, or would he disappoint his grandmother? What would you do? He didn't really like his father because he made him spend all his time on the trivia of military service, according to Saunders. Paul lived in Gatchina, which he turned into a military camp, drilling the troops under his personal control, according again to A Concise History of Russia by Buskovich. His father was obsessed with control, which could have explained some of Alexander's tendencies. Think about it. As a boy, all of his key decisions were made for him, including his schooling, his marriage, and his career. He never held control of his own life, so he spent the rest of his life yearning for that security. He was also pretty scared of his father, who, like I said, was known as the Mad Tsar, for essentially reversing every reform made by Catherine. This fear made Alexander much more obliged to seek approval from his father, but it also created an uncomfortable and traumatic childhood for him. Almost makes you feel bad for him in a way. This may help explain his inability to follow through with his promises, as he wanted to please please others, but also keep that control. When visiting his grandmother in St. Petersburg, Alexander experienced quite the opposite setting. St. Petersburg during the Enlightenment was buzzing. It was the center of innovation and enlightened people of Russia. Alexander would travel back and forth from these different settings, focusing on military tactics in Gatchina and on his studies in St. Petersburg. Catherine and Paul's hostile relationship was very evident in these settings. They would both chastise each other to Alexander, which is pretty awkward. There comes a point where you just know too much and want out, I would say. This may help explain the development of his personality, like his shape-shifting tendencies, his need to please others, and his obsession with control. That conservatism in Gatchina and liberalism in St. Petersburg were being drilled nonstop into his mind, which probably blurred his outlook on these political ideas. This is probably why his political ideology is so messy, which you can see in his erratic reign. The most interesting part about all of his influences, and we will conclude here, is how each of them are linked. While La Harpe, Paul, and Catherine all had different effects on Alexander's development, they also shared a number of similarities. La Harpe confirmed Alexander's autocratic ideals, Paul fostered Alexander's obsession with control, and Catherine basically wanted to live through him, which probably contributed to that control issue. These three relationships definitely played key roles in his development, which ultimately led to a reign characterized by mystery and quite puzzling contradictions.